Hey everybody, Tom here, and today I want to give you some teaching tips for how to teach Lords of Hellas. I have made some videos, one where I teach you how to set up Lords of Hellas, and one where I teach you how to play Lords of Hellas as I play the game. If you haven't seen those yet and you're interested in seeing them, I have gone ahead and put the links to those in the description of this video, so you can go ahead and just click on those if you're interested in seeing them. But having said that, let's go ahead and I'll give you a couple of tips on how to teach this kind of big game. My first tip, of course, is about having the appropriate audience. So let's talk about the audience of this game. This game is not a beginner's game. This is not a gateway game. This is not really for kids. This is a game for experienced gamers. So this is one, like, it's not the heaviest, biggest game in the whole wide world. You don't need to be the most experienced gamer by any means. But you do want to have a few bigger games under your belt before you get into this game here. Especially if you have a few dudes on a map games beyond Risk. If you have a few modern games like that under your belt, that would be probably a helpful thing to have before diving into Lords of Hellas. In fact, like for me, I still use Blood Rage as one of my go-to gateway. I mean, I don't mean gateway in the typical sense, but when I meet somebody who is interested in gaming, maybe they've played a few smaller ones, or maybe that night I've taught them a few smaller games. But if their game that they are familiar with is Risk, Blood Rage is usually something I bring out pretty early on, and this would be a nice next step to Blood Rage. So like you'd have Blood Rage, and then maybe after that you would want to do either Rising Sun or Lords of Hellas. To me, both of those kind of are in the same tier where they're just a little bit more complicated and things like that. So, as per usual, my second tip is about letting people help set up the game. So, I know that it's, kind of a common popular thing to have a game set up ready to go for game night, and to invite people in and to have things ready to go. But in general, one of my general teaching tips is to let people help you set up the game. This gives them a chance to start seeing things as they are coming out of the box and hopefully not be so overwhelmed as they might be coming into the table. So with this game specifically, I think that there are two good things that you could do. The first thing is, if this kind of has to do with the expansion a little bit, but if you have the terrain expansion, so if you did get this, let people help you put the cities on the map and kind of pull the temples out and put them on the one card. But if you can have the board laid out and tell the players with that expansion especially, hand them the plastic cities and say, hey, I need you to look at the board for this icon, and anywhere you see that icon or whatever, you're going to go ahead and put one of these cities on there. That's going to give people a chance to explore and hopefully see, okay, on this map there are cities and shrines or spaces for temples. And so those are kind of the two big things in each of those regions, and they're getting a chance to really explore that. They won't have such an opportunity because with the temples, because all of the temples go in the corner, but you could say, hey, like you could point out that icon as you're having them set up the game. Say, hey, we have two different kinds of regions. We've got regions with cities and regions with temples. I need you to put these on the cities. And then, hey, I have this card for the temples, boop, and I need you to put the temples onto this card. We'll also give you a chance to kind of show the big Sparta miniature or that part on the map, and it will also give them a chance to see the Oracle of Delphi or Delphi. I don't know which one it is still, and that gets on the card as well. Anyway, so the first part of setup is let them, especially if you have the terrain expansion, let them put the cities onto the map, because those cities don't exist in the base game. The second thing is, you and the people should all be working together to set up all of those decks of cards. So as they're putting the cities on the board, you are taking that big deck of cards, separating it into the little decks, and then you're going to be handing them, and you take some and you shuffle them up, and you say, hey, could you find the spot on the board where this goes? And then you're kind of showing them how all of these different kinds of cards are going to go on these different parts of the board. And after that, setup is almost done. At that point, it's just about getting the individual players set up, and that's something that, of course, you're going to all do together. All right, that's going to bring us to tip number 3, which is all focused on your rules explanation. This is the biggest one for sure. So let's start by talking about the most basic thing, which I always say. You get that game ready, the first thing you need to do with any game is talk about the objective. What are you trying to do and how do you win? That is so important in any game, but it is extremely important in this game, where learning those 4 objectives is really confusing and tricky for people learning this game for the first time. At least it was for me. And so when you go into the objective conversation, you want to be prepared and organize the way you present those objectives in a smooth way. You want to be prepared. Don't just jumble around. I feel like in my video I was a little bit jumbly, and I'm blaming that mostly on the fact that when I was recording the video, I had to explain the objectives for all of the different player accounts, because viewers are going to have different player accounts in their game. But when you're explaining the objectives, don't talk about any other player count other than the player count that you are playing with at that time. So you're going to explain the 4 objectives. Maybe you'll talk about other player counts at the end of the game if people care, but you need to ignore that for now. You just want to talk about your objectives as that group playing the game. The other thing is, you really want to think beforehand, how do you want to present those objectives? And I could think of 2 different ways to present those objectives in a clean way. The first way is to talk about, like, of the 4 objectives, 3 of them, is this helpful that my fingers are here? 3 of those objectives are all about the hoplites controlling the areas. So you could be like, hey, you need to control 2 lands, or you need to control 5 temples, or you need to control a completed monument region by the end of the game to win the game. Or you need to kill, why is this being up here? You need to kill 3 monsters. So that's one way to do it, to organize your objectives by kind of physicality of the game. The other way that you may want to consider doing is thinking of some kind of a numeric helpful device. So what I mean by that is, I kind of noticed while I was reading the rules that in a 4-player game, for example, you kind of have the numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5. So for example, you need to control 2 lands. You need to kill 3 monsters. You need to control a region after you get 4 more pieces into the monument. And the other one is 5 temples. So you could kind of organize that by talking about the 2, 3, 4, 5 rule. Again, that's controlling 2 lands, killing 3 monsters, controlling the region with a monument, and there are 4 more pieces to be added to that monument, or controlling 5 regions with temples. So having some way to have your thoughts organized about those objectives, giving people some way to remember the objectives, I think is going to be really helpful as you're teaching people this game for their first time. The next thing is, after you've explained the objectives, and something I'm going to say is you're going to want to repeat those objectives a lot. But as you're explaining those objectives, or after you have explained them, the next thing you should do is explain the difference between a hoplite and a hero. Because most, dudes on a map games, the hero is usually like 2 times the power of a regular soldier or something like that. But in this game, the hoplites and the heroes do completely different things, and that needs to be very clear. And so you need to go over the pieces that are in front of them. So you've explained the objectives, and then you're going to talk about the hoplites. And as you explain, the hoplites are the guys that go around the map, and they are the ones that can actually control the regions. And so that means that they're going to help you with these 3 goals: controlling the 2 lands, the 5 temples, or the 1 completed monument, right? Oh, hey, look, 1 completed monument. That's a different way to do it. We're learning. So you're going to explain the hoplites, tie it back to the 3 objectives that have to do with the hoplites. And then you're going to say, now the hero is completely different. The hero can't do any of those things directly. They can't control any of these regions, so don't plan on them doing that necessarily. The hero is going to go on these quests, and the quests will just help boost your statistics. And the heroes are going to kill the monsters. Remember that killing 3 monsters is one of the objectives of the games. So you're going to explain your main objectives, and then you want to talk about the differences between the hoplites and the hero and tie those into the 4 main objectives. After that, I've mentioned this in my general teaching tips video, your turn order definitely matters, and this falls into the category of a big game with a lot of steps per turn. You need to be the first person to take a step, or take your turn, because you're going to talk about all of the possible steps in this game. Now this game is really nice because there's a lot of things you can't do until a few rounds later. You can only start with pretty basic things. So for example, at the beginning of the game, mostly you can move 1 hoplite, and you can move your hero 1 space. And then you're going to take a special action. So you want to take the first turn, and while you're taking your first turn, you're going to explain all of the actions as clearly but as quickly as you can, because you don't want to overwhelm them. But as you guys saw in the video, yeah, it takes a little bit to learn the game, but once turns get going, they go pretty quickly. And so you're going to be very active in that first round, repeating, okay, you're going to do these regular actions in whatever order you want to. Remember, these regular actions are helping contribute to your overall objective. And then here's these special actions, and here's how these special actions are going to help you contribute to the overall objectives as well. Then after that, I would carve out some time to just quickly explain quests. Because quests are tricky in that they have nothing to do with the objectives directly, right? They just give you rewards and they help you boost your stats. And so talking about the different ways that you can boost your stats or what the statistics mean, talking about quests next is a great thing to do because they are tied directly. Like you need to raise these stats, and once you have these stats raised, you can go on this quest. And so you're going to bring in the quest, you're going to talk about how each of these cards has a token on the board somewhere, and so to go to this card you need to go to that token, and you're talking about the minimum requirements. So not only is boosting your stats good for the things you can do on the board, boosting your stats is good because you can go on these quests which will get you rewards ultimately. And so I would talk about the quests during my turn when I'm talking about the actions, talk about the benefits of the quests because they're not going to come up naturally any other time. And then specifically you want to talk about the minimum requirements. You're trying to raise these stats so you can go on these quests there. And then you can briefly talk about the rewards. Maybe you want to read the rewards together, but even reading the rewards at this point I think might be a little overwhelming, but you can say there are good rewards for you. Read them if they want to read. It doesn't matter. So after you've talked about your objectives and then you have talked about heroes versus hoplites, you've taken the first turn and you've talked about the different kinds of actions and the quests, then it's time to talk about the monsters. Specifically, you may be, depending on how many monsters are on the board, right? You may want to save the big attacks. Talking about the regional attacks until later is probably my recommendation. I didn't talk about it in the video until right up until it was time to do that, but I had that liberty because I wasn't having the questions in my brain. Maybe you guys were, right? But what you do want to do is talk about the passive abilities for any monsters that might be on the board. Now, as I was preparing my thoughts for this specific video, I was so angry at myself because I can't believe I didn't think about this before recording the gameplay video. But the passive abilities are so easy to forget because they're passive, and it's easy to forget to teach them while you're playing. And in reality, while I was recording the video, I completely forgot to mention them. And so an idea that I came up with was there are 3 monsters that have passive abilities. So my tip is take a red Sharpie or whatever you want to. I just use red because red is the monster color in this game. And what I did on the 3 monsters, so it was the Chimera that I had labels, Medusa, and the Sphinx. They all have passive abilities. And what I did is I just went, can you see this? Oh, and I put a little exclamation point on the monster with that Sharpie. I know, don't freak out, don't be mad at me if you don't like people drawing on those. But by having these marks on these specific monsters, if someone's going to move into that land, you know, because of these little exclamation point or whatever kind of a symbol you want to put on there, right? So I just threw an exclamation point to say, hey, if you're going into a land with that monster, there's something on this card that we need to check. And so when talking about monsters specifically, say, hey, these monsters with this kind of a marking, that's something you want to be aware of, you know, during the round stuff, not necessarily at the end of the round monster attacks things. But these monsters in particular have something we need to be aware of. And that's going to bring us to tip number 4, which is which rules can you wait on? So I've basically mentioned all of the things that I would mention before and during the first turn of the game, which is your turn of the game, right? You should be the first player. And then the other thing that I want to say is that the things that you can wait on are the combat. Combat is complicated in this game, and it's not, at least in a 2-player game, right? It doesn't come up frequently enough to bog people down with that information at the very beginning. So my tip is both for the hoplite combat, but also the monster combat, which is let people come to you seeking how do hoplites fight. So there are basically, my recommendation is when it comes to hoplite combat, you want to wait for the earliest of these 3 opportunities to explain hoplite combat. Either number 1, when somebody asks. Obviously, if somebody's going to ask, you might have to change your plan for the timing. Like if someone's asking really early, give them a very brief overview about those combat cards, because again, the combat cards are kind of confusing too. But for hoplite, you want to wait until you're asked, Or wait until the second round, because the first round is super simple. Maybe the third round, actually, second or third round. Or you take an opportunity. This is probably my real recommendation. Maybe on round 2, you take the opportunity, and even if it's not to your advantage, take the opportunity to attack someone and say, here's how attacking is going to work. I'm going to attack here. If you're doing it early on and early enough in the game, maybe there won't be grave consequences for anybody, and they're going to be able to have a hands-on experience of how hoplite attacking combat works. Same thing is going to go for the monster combat. Wait until you're asked, maybe wait until rounds 2 or 3, or send your hero over there and attack a monster as quickly as possible so that they can get a feel for how a monster attack is going to work, because again, that is pretty complicated stuff. So wait on hoplite movement or hoplite combat and monster combat until a couple rounds into the game. My final set of tips for this particular game is repetition and explaining your inner thoughts is paramount. Those things are what's going to, I think, make the experience better. Obviously, you don't want to do it ad nauseum. Is that a thing? You don't want to annoy people, but the 4 different objectives are confusing and watching for them is tough. You don't want to be like ratting people out who are trying to sneak up, but what I'm saying is that you want to repeat the objectives in context, especially on your turn. So as soon as your hoplites are controlling a new region, say, hey, look, I'm this much closer to controlling the blue region. Remember, I need to get, or land, I need to get 2 lands in order to win the game. Or do that for the temples. As soon as you build a temple, here is one of my 5 temples that I'm building now. Things like that. So you want to repeat the objectives in context of the things that you're doing on your turn. In addition to that, make sure that you're explaining your strategy, especially during the first half. And that also ties into the objectives. You're saying, hey, I'm thinking that I'm hopefully going to be able to come over here and eventually combat you, so be aware that there's a combat coming and yada yada. But to have a positive first experience where you're going to have the upper hand as somebody familiar with the rules, it's really important in this game that you are explaining your inner strategy, especially because those 4 objectives are going to come up. So that's it, you guys. I'm trying to keep the rambling down on these videos. I'm still hopeful that these videos are going to be kind of a cool new addition into our hobby, and I hope that that's useful. Do you have any tips to bring to the table? Is there something that you've done to teach Lords of Hellas better? Is there something that I've missed? Things like that. Leave me a comment. I would love to know, because I don't think that my video was a great example. Like, I think it was an okay example of how to teach the game, but it could have been better. And maybe some of these tips will help you. Again, I'm so angry at myself that I didn't think about marking the monsters. So if you take nothing else from this game, maybe that would be a cool thing. I was kind of, I like that idea a lot for myself. So if you have any thoughts, go ahead and leave me a comment. Thank you guys so much for watching and for being patient. It's been a while since I've been able to post a video, and I hope you have a good day. We'll see you later. Take care. Bye.